Hey guys, so today I'm going to show you how to swap springs and shocks on your BMW M2, M3, M4. Now, I'm not actually going to be using these exact parts in my hands, but you know, if you're swapping aftermarket parts like, you know, Bilstein dampers or, you know, aftermarket springs, even though this is a stock spring, this will absolutely apply to you. All right, let's hop in. So before you hop into swapping the suspension on your F8x car, I want to talk about the unique and special tools that you're going to need. Now, even if you're a tool guy, you may not have what you need to get this done, and that's going to be a 12-point pass-through socket, specifically 18 millimeters if you're just working with the OE stuff. Probably the most well-known one is the ECS Tuning and Schwaben pass-through socket set, and that's a number of 12 points that they have in the range from like 18 millimeter all the way up to 22 millimeter. Here's the 18 right here. You can see it's got this cutout right here, so you can put a hex or, you know, an open-ended wrench in it. But this will not work for the rear top mount. This will only work for the front. For the rear top mount, you will also need a 12-point 18 millimeter. However, the outer diameter, or the OD of the socket, has to be less than 25 millimeters. And unfortunately, this guy right here is 26 millimeters. Now, you know, I have a couple other pass-through socket sets as well, and none of them had an 18 millimeter that was small enough to fit inside the rear top mount. So I actually visited like 4 different stores before I finally found one at my local AutoZone that would actually work. So, you know, I'll put a link to, you know, something that'll work in the video description, but just, you know, something to keep track of, keep note of. Before you start this, make sure you have this tool. And if you're doing an aftermarket suspension, like let's say you're doing Bilstein or whatever, those guys, they use an even larger pass-through socket, so they'll use something like a 22 millimeter for the front. So, you know, just make sure you know what you're getting into and you have all the tools, you know, all the unique tools that you may need. Okay, so let's start taking apart things in the engine bay while the car's on the ground, and the reason why I like to do that is just it's at a more convenient working height, unless you're like really tall. So anyways, we need to remove these covers on each side, and as you can see, there are 3 10 millimeter cams. So we're going to go ahead and turn those cams 90 degrees. Don't torque it too hard because you can accidentally break the plastic stops, and then you won't know which way your cam is really facing. And then over here on the side of that cover, we have an expanding rivet, so you need to use a forked trim tool to kind of pull up the center stud, and once you pull up the center stud, then you can pull out the base. Then we can go ahead and pull this cover up and out. Next, we're going to remove all of the various, you know, expanding plastic rivets on this rubber top cover here, so go ahead and take your forked trim tool again and remove all of those. And for the expanding rivet over here on the side, you can see I've actually just taken my pry trim tool and gone in from the front underneath the rubber piece to go ahead and get that. Now we can go ahead and remove this rubber piece, and you can see it just kind of pulls it up, and you can remove it completely, or you can just kind of put it off to the side here. It doesn't really matter. If you have an electronic suspension, there'll be a plug coming out of here, so now it's the time when you'd go and you disconnect that plug. Be a little bit careful with it, because sometimes they can be a little delicate, and it's kind of a pain if you manage to break the internal wiring or connector. So now I'm going to go ahead and just get brake torque on the nut that holds the damper to the top mount. And so I'm going to stick my 10 millimeter wrench in there, and I've got the pass-through 18 millimeter on top. And I'm just going to break that torque so that's easier to unscrew later. Now, we don't want to unscrew that nut all the way just yet. We just want to get the brake torque on it so that it's easier to unscrew later when the car is off the ground. Now let's send the car up. Once the car is up in the air, we're going to take our 17 millimeter and undo all of the lug nut bolts. And when we get to the final lug bolt, the wheel's going to want to fall off, so I just use my foot underneath to kind of support it so that it doesn't. Now we can go ahead and grab the wheel and pull it off. Over here on the driver's side, we're going to need to remove the headlight leveling sensor here. And what we'll do, you can use a fork trim tool kind of like this to pop it off. It's not going to come off super easy, so you will have to put a little force into it, and can also help, you know, to try and bend it all the way to one side to pop it off of the ball here. So we're going to start by undoing the end link right here, and to do that you need a 16mm pass-through and a T30 counterhold. So you can see I've got a 16mm on a extension, and as well as my T30, so I'm going to get that T30 started, then I'm going to get the 16mm on there, and then I'm just going to unscrew this. And you can do this with an impact as well. If you want to just put the impact on the counter hold, and you can just spin that, or you can, you know, do it this way and spin the nut. Now we can pop the end link out, and we'll just set it, you know, to the side in front here out of the way. Next, we're going to undo this clamp bolt here for the lower knuckle, and this is going to be a 16mm on the front side and a 16mm on the back as well. Now we can go ahead and take that bolt out, and we can also take this bracket out as well. Okay, next let's go ahead and place a jack supporting the knuckle and rotor, so that when we release all the tension on stuff, this thing doesn't just come falling off. So now I'm going to use this spreader tool, and you can see it's oblong, so it can fit in the slot in behind the knuckle like so, and then you turn it 90 degrees to kind of spread the knuckle apart so that we can drop the knuckle off of the strut. And then I'm going to take my ratchet off of that spreader tool, because we don't need the ratchet in there. We just need this to keep it open to slide it off of the strut. It can also help to spray a little bit of penetrating oil at the strut and knuckle interface, you know, WD-40, liquid wrench, etc., to help this assembly slide off. Okay, now that we have everything set down below, I'm going to go ahead and take that special 18mm strut nut socket and my 10mm open wrench, and I'm going to finish taking off the nut that holds the strut to the top mount. Okay, now that we've undone the nut at the top that secures the strut to the top mount, we can begin to lower our jack and the spring and strut assembly. Okay, now that we've dropped the knuckle and strut assembly, what we're going to do is we're going to rotate this out of the wheel well, and you may want something like a microfiber towel just to toss over the top of the spring and the strut so that you don't scratch your fenders. So I'm just going to do that here, make sure I get this over, and then I'm going to push down and rotate it out. So now we have the strut angled out, and we can just simply pull off the spring and rubber boot bump stop assembly. And we can also just pull out the damper. Okay, so here we have the spring assembly and the rubber dust boot, and you can see right here where this little blue paint is, that's the stop for the end of the spring right there. A lot of people accidentally think this is the stop, but really what that is, that's a ramp built in. So you can see how the spring tapers and rests against that ramp. So this is not the stop, this is, and this is just to support the spring. Additionally, on the other side, we have this little capture, which just, you know, kind of centers things. All right, now let's reassemble our front strut. If you're changing to a different strut, like, you know, let's say you get an aftermarket one, make sure to take this rubber lower spring pad and place that back onto the perch. And you can see this guy has a little nub that slots into the perch right there, and the rest of it just kind of, you know, sits in this channel. And then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take our spring and put that on. And remember, BMW has a spring tag on here that says which side is up and down. This one says unten, or lower, so that means I need to turn this spring around. And as close as the, you know, inside diameter of the upper and lowers look, they actually are different. So it does matter which way you install this. And now with the spring on here, we can now take our dust boot and drop that in from the top. And the dust boot also has certain alignment features. So if you look over here, there's this little plastic, or this little rubber nub, and that's the spring stop. So that's going to sit against the end of the spring, just like so. And if I turn it some more, you'll see that there's this other little ridge. A lot of people sometimes mistake that for the spring stop, but it's not. It's really just a ramp to help the dust boot kind of support the curvature of the spring. And lastly, if we go 180 degrees from that, we have this little tab here that just kind of sits on the outside of the spring to keep things centered. So once we have the dust boot on, don't forget your bump stop. These things are hidden because, well, they stay behind the dust boot. So that just drops on the shaft right there. And then we can take our strut assembly, and we're going to look for this little alignment nub, which is going to go in the brake in the strut knuckle clamp up here. If you're using an aftermarket damper, sometimes there's a little pin instead of this nub. And then what we'll do is we will just drop the strut into there, making sure that nub follows into that brake in the clamp. Now we're ready to pivot this assembly back into the wheel well, and you know, once again, you can put a microfiber towel over this part so that you don't scratch your fenders, and if you have to, you can press down on the piston shaft of the damper a little bit, so give yourself a little bit more room to clear. And once it's in there, then I can go ahead and take out the microfiber towel, and we can align it with the top mount. Now we can go ahead and jack up the assembly, and you know, make sure from the top hat side that the damper piston strut is aligned in the hole it's supposed to go up into. And then once you see, you know, this post up here, go ahead and take the 18mm nut and just put that on by hand, get started, just so this can't accidentally drop through the top mount again. Now we want to jack the wheel carrier up until we start to see the spring start to compress, because that'll let us know that the strut is fully pushed into the knuckle. And now we can go ahead and take our ratchet and remove our knuckle spreader tool. Then let's take this bracket and put this back on, and this little claw side of it goes in between the open area of the knuckle. And then we can take our 16mm and screw this bolt in. And then this will get torqued to 56 Newton meters or 41 foot-pounds. Now go ahead and adjust your jack if you need to, so that we can take the end link and insert it back into the mount. And then we'll take the 16mm nut and put that back on. Then we can get our T30 counterhold, 16mm pass-through, and tighten this nut back up. And then this will get torqued to 56 Newton meters or 41 foot-pounds. If for some reason you're unlucky and you can't just torque this with a socket and the ball joint keeps spinning, you may have to do something funky like here, where I've got the T30 counterhold still in there, and then I've got my torque wrench with a crow's foot on the pass-through socket. If you do it this way, make sure that crow's foot is 90 degrees from the head or handle of your torque wrench. Otherwise, the torque you have set on the torque wrench will not actually be the torque applied. So now we're going to put this headlight leveling sensor back on, and you can put it on the ball and push really hard to get it on there. Sometimes it can be really difficult even just pushing, and so you may want to do something like grab a pair of channel locks to clamp the arm on there and the back side of the ball to press it on. Now let's go ahead and get our 18mm 12-point pass-through and our 10mm again socket, and finish tightening down the bolt that holds the strut to the top mount. And if you're doing this while the car's in the air, make sure that you have a jack, you know, propping up the knuckle assembly, so that, you know, this is pushing all the way up and out. Otherwise, you can also wait until you put the car on the ground to do this. And then this top mount is going to get torqued to 71 Newton meters or 52 foot-pounds. Next, we're going to replace this rubber cover, but if you have electronic suspension, go ahead and make sure you plug in that upper connector if you have it. This rubber cover, it just kind of falls right in place. You know, make sure this part goes over this other rubber piece, and you can see the rest of it just kind of naturally goes where it needs to. Now we can take all of our plastic expanding rivets and put them in their respective holes. And then we can replace the side shields, which slot under a tab in the center section, and then they push down. And make sure this is flush over here before we take our 10mm and give these a quarter turn. When it's in the locked position, there's little arrows that should show that they line up and point at each other. And then we have our last expanding rivet, which goes on the side of those side covers. So back here on the driver's side, rear camber arm, this is the headlight leveling sensor. And we don't need to undo this like we did the front, but you will want to pay attention to how it is oriented now. So if you can see, it's pointing from the sensor module out towards the wheel, this little arm, and sometimes when we lower this lower camber arm later, swapping springs, this can get pushed to the other side and throw off your headlight leveling. So just be aware of this sensor and its correct orientation. All right, we're going to undo these 3 E12 bolts holding the top mount for the damper to the car. Next, on the bottom, we're going to undo the 18mm nut in the rear and the bolt from the front in order to take out the damper. Alternatively, you could just only undo this 18 below and not undo the top of the damper if swapping springs only. Now, if you're only taking out the damper, you can go ahead and just press down from up here, and you can see it slowly start to compress. And what we want to do is we want to get this short enough so that we can pull it out. And I haven't removed the bottom bolt because that's what I'm pressing against. If you do, then it can get wedged in the arm and be a little bit difficult. So now that I have this fully compressed, now I'm going to go ahead, remove that bolt down below, and pull the damper out. Okay, so in order to drop this camber arm, we're going to need to undo the camber adjustment bolt here. And you can see from the factory, BMW put a little paint mark on there, so I know where I would need to align it when I put it back together. But if you're doing this and you've changed your alignment since, well, you should probably take a whiteout or a Sharpie or something and give yourself some new witness marks. So now we're going to go ahead and pull this bolt out. You can see I've got my 21mm on ratchet in the back side, and I'm going to use a 21mm for the bolt head on the rear side of the car as well. Now that this nut is off the other side, I jacked up the arm a little bit to where this bolt didn't have tension anymore, so I can just pull it out. Now we can go ahead and lower our jack, and that will lower the arm, releasing the spring. And then you can see we can just take the spring right out. Now there is this metal cup up here, and if you're going to an aftermarket suspension that has its own adjustable perch, you'll most likely remove this cup, and you can do that by getting a hammer, kind of knocking it down from the top, hitting the top down, or you can kind of wedge a plastic pry tool and slowly work your way around. So here is the rear spring, and you can see at the top they have this little boot or a spring isolator, and you can see that it's got a curvature inside to it so that the coil goes in and slides into place. There is a stop for it. You can see that right here at the bottom. So here we have the rear M2 competition spring, and like I said, this is very similar in construction to the M3, M4 competition, but those do have different spring rates. So just thinking that you can put this one on M3, M4, well, it'll fit, but you're not going to get the spring rate BMW designed. Another thing you can notice is the coil diameter on the top and the bottom aren't necessarily the same, and they are both a little bit smaller than the main spring itself. Once again, we can see this has a tag, and the 2-letter code for this M2 is just M2. And even though this tag here doesn't say upper or oben or unter or lower, for the rear springs, the tag is towards the upper side of the spring. So this one, they didn't do a very good job. It's not too far off from the middle, but you can see it's still closer to the top. Also, on the bottom side of the spring, they have another little spring pad isolator, and this thing, once again, just slides right onto the spring till it stops. And it does have this little nub, and this nub will go into a hole on that lower camber arm that the spring sits against. Okay, now we're going to pop off this top piece here, and to do that I'm just going to use a plastic pry tool. And you can see in the back there's this little piece nub that goes into a hole here. Then we'll take off the gasket. Make sure not to damage this, because you'll want this later. Okay, so here is the top mount for the rear damper, and this is kind of tricky, to be honest with you, because you need an 18mm 12-point pass-through for this. But the problem is a lot of pass-through sockets like the Schwaben 18mm or even this Harbor Freight one, they don't fit in here. They're too wide. The outer diameter of the socket is too large. And I actually had to go, search a couple different stores to find something that would work. I went to, O'Reilly's and so forth. But finally at AutoZone, they have this Duralast pass-through socket kit. And theirs is thin-walled enough so where it actually fits in there. And once you get that in there, this particular kit has about a 14mm inner diameter. Then I could use a 1/4 inch 10mm socket in order to counter hold. So that's what I needed to do for this guy. Make sure you have the right tools, because a lot of tools that you would think would work, they really don't. So now I'm just going to counter hold with one hand, and with the other I'm just going to unscrew that nut off of the damper. Okay, now we've got this nut all the way loose and off. Then we can just pull the top mount off, and well, I guess you can see the bump stop came with it. And then here's the damper. Really nothing too special about this on its own. This one, like the front damper, is a monotube as well. And once again, we have that nice lightweight aluminum body. So here we have the top mount and bump stop assembly, and this just friction fits in there like that. This kind of plastic dust and grime shield, it just slots onto a slot on the bump stop, so you can grab the bump stop and grab this and twist and pull to pop these two pieces apart. Looking some more at the top mount, if you look in here, you see that little bit of foam, and that's interesting. I haven't seen one of these with that little piece of foam right there before, but what I'm pretty sure that is that's the foam material that encapsulates this washer here that the damper mounts to. And the reason why this washer is encapsulated with foam in this assembly, and you can see on the bottom side too, we see the washer, and we see the foam, then we see the outer body of the top mount, is that's what absorbs all of the NVH. So this is how they try and keep the ride nice and quiet and compliant in the cabin. Okay, now let's go ahead and reassemble the damper. So the first thing we'll do is we'll take the bump stop and dust shield and just pop that over. Then you can go ahead and take the top mount, put that on, and then we'll go ahead and take that difficult to work with 18mm 12-point nut and place that on, and then just screw that down. Then you'll need to take your 18mm 12-point pass-through and your 10mm socket and tighten that nut down. And then we're going to torque this to 38 Newton meters or 28 foot-pounds. And you can see here, I've actually put my torque wrench on the internal 10mm counter hold, so that works too. Now we can go ahead and put on this gasket. The side with the text goes up, and then you can take that plastic cap, and don't forget the little pin in the back that slots into the hole over here, and then you can press that on, and make sure the holes in the gasket align before you put this cap on securely, because it will pinch the gasket and stop it from moving later. Now let's get the spring ready for installation. We'll find the tag on the back so we know which side is up. The tag is on the upper side, and then on the upper side we'll go ahead and take that rubber stop mount and we'll thread it on. So you'll turn it until you feel it stop, and then we'll do the same for the bottom. We'll take that bottom one on. This one's a little bit more obvious since you can see it, and we'll just turn that on there till it's fully seated and stopped. Now we're going to put the spring back into the car, and on the lower camber arm you can see a little hole right here, and that's where this little plug on the rubber bottom part of the spring is supposed to slot into. So go ahead and index that down there. Drop the spring in, and you can push the arm down so that you can get the top in. Next I'm going to go ahead and put the damper in. And if you're only replacing the damper and you haven't undone the camber bolt on the arm, well, you probably will have to manually compress this damper before you drop it in there. Otherwise it'll be a little bit too long to just get in on its own. So we'll get that slotted down there. Now we can go ahead and place the bolt that secures the damper from the bottom, and that bolt enters from the front And then next what we'll do is we'll just start the nut on the back side, but we're not going to tighten this all the way yet. And the reason why is the damper has a rubber bushing on the bottom, and we don't want to torque bushings until the wheel assembly or wheel carrier is at static ride height, because we don't want to induce any bind when it should be at its natural resting position. Now we'll go ahead and take our jack and jack up that lower camber arm till the wheel carrier aligns with the slot. And then we can put the camber bolt back through, and this guy enters from the rear side of the car. Then from the front side we can go ahead and put on the eccentric washer, and you can see it'll only slot onto the bolt one way. So we'll put it on and turn it. And then we can go ahead and put the nut on there. And we're not going to tighten everything down because we want to be able to get this eccentric bolt or eccentric washer into the slot. So we'll go ahead and turn the bolt from the other side till this guy can get in there. Now that everything's aligned and the bolts in the bottom are all in, let's go ahead and jack up the wheel assembly till it's in the normal position. And if you can't get all the way there, that's okay. You do want to get it as close to where the wheel would be at static ride height as possible. Next, let's insert the 3 E12 bolts that go from the top mount to the body, and we'll just get those started. Now we'll go ahead and take our 18mm and we'll torque the damper to 100 Newton meters or 74 foot-pounds. Next, go ahead and take your 21mm and turn that camber bolt till all the witness marks align, so we keep the same alignment as before. And then we can get our torque wrench with 21mm in the back and 21mm in the front. And you do want to put the torque wrench in front because that's where the tightening nut is. And we're going to tighten that to 165 Newton meters or 122 foot-pounds. Now we can take our E12 and finish bolting up these bolts for top mount, and then torque them to 28 Newton meters or 21 foot-pounds. Then lastly, we just have to take our wheels and put them back on. Then we can take our 17mm and get these wheel bolts back in there, and then we'll torque these in a star pattern to 130 Newton meters or 104 foot-pounds.